The padlock was new, that's what stopped me cold on my son's front porch. Not the silence, not the drawn curtains, not the way the welcome mat had been kicked to one side. It was the padlock. Brand new, shiny brass bolted through a hasp that hadn't been there the last time I visited, on the outside of the basement door. I stood there in the November cold, my hand still on the spare key my son had given me 7 years ago, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet. My name is Leonard. I'm 64 years old. I worked 31 years as a building inspector for Clackamas County, Oregon. I know how houses are put together. I know load-bearing walls and foundation cracks, and what rot looks like behind drywall. I know when something is wrong with a structure just by standing in a room, and something was very wrong here. Let me back up, because the story doesn't start on that porch. It starts the way most terrible stories start, slowly, with small things you explain away because the alternative is too painful to consider. My son's name is Kevin. He's 38. When he was 12 years old, he used to wait for me at the end of our driveway after school, so he could tell me about his day before he even got inside the house. He couldn't wait. That's the boy I raised. That's the boy I kept in my head, even as the man he became grew harder to recognize. Kevin married a woman named Sherry 6 years ago. I tried to like her. I genuinely tried. She was polished in a way that made me uncomfortable. Always dressed like she was about to give a presentation, always laughing a half second after everyone else, like she was running the calculation before deciding it was safe. My wife, Patsy, said I was being unfair. She said I was one of those fathers who'd never think any woman was good enough for his son. Maybe she was right. I told myself she was right. I stopped paying attention to the things that bothered me. Patsy passed away 2.5 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I don't talk about those 4 months much. I'll just say that Kevin was there, mostly at the beginning. And then he wasn't, mostly, at the beginning. And then he wasn't, mostly, at the end. Sherry had a work conference, then another one. Then Kevin had things he couldn't get out of. I held Patsy's hand by myself on the last night, and I told her it was okay, and she smiled at me like she knew something I didn't, which she usually did. After the funeral, Kevin called every week for about a month. Then every 2 weeks. Then it became me calling him, and him sounding distracted, and Sherry's voice in the background saying something I couldn't make out. I'm not a man who requires a lot of reassurance. I grew up in a household where my father worked 60 hours a week and considered putting food on the table the primary expression of love. I learned not to need more than what I was given. But after Patsy died, something shifted. I needed my son. I'm not ashamed to say that now. I had some money put away, not a fortune, but enough. The house was paid off. I had my pension and social security, and Patsy and I had been careful over the years. When Kevin told me he and Sherry were having some financial trouble, his contracting business had slowed, some clients hadn't paid, I didn't hesitate. I wrote a check for $18,000. He paid me back 4 months later. Every cent. So when he came to me again 8 months after that, I didn't hesitate then either. 22,000. He was grateful. He hugged me in the driveway when he left, the way he used to when he was young. I held on to that hug longer than I should have. Looking back, I think that hug was calculated. I hate that I think that, but I do. The third time was a loan. He said he'd pay back in 90 days. $31,000. He had a big job coming in, a commercial renovation in Beaverton, and he just needed the cash flow to cover materials. 90 days came and went. I didn't push. He was my son. Then the calls started spacing out again. Thanksgiving, he said they were going to Sherry's family in Phoenix. Christmas, same thing. I drove to their house on December 26th with a box of presents and a pot of chili Patsy used to make. Sherry answered the door. Kevin was on a job, she said. On December 26th, she took the chili with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I drove home with the presents still in my car. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand that what happened next didn't come out of nowhere. The signs were there. I just kept finding reasons not to read them. In February, I started having trouble reaching Kevin on his cell. It would ring 4 times and go to voicemail, the way a phone does when someone sees the name on the screen and sets it face down. I left messages, cheerful ones because I didn't want to sound desperate. I told him about the robin that had started nesting in the eave above my back door. I told him the Blazers were having a decent season. I told him I'd found some of his baseball cards in a box in the garage and thought he might want them. He texted back short replies, "Busy. Talk soon. You good?" Then in March the text stopped too. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of silence from my son. I called his contracting company's listed number and got a recording saying the mailbox was full. I drove by the business address he had on his website, a small office in a strip mall in Milwaukee, and the suite was dark, a paper sign on the door I couldn't quite read from the parking lot. When I walked up to it, it said the space was available for lease. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself I was catastrophizing the way the grief counselor I'd seen after Patsy's death said I sometimes did. I told myself Kevin was going through something and would reach out when he was ready. Then one of our neighbors, a retired teacher named Florence who lives 3 houses down and knows everything that happens on our street because she walks her dog twice a day at the exact times when people are coming and going. Florence called me on a Thursday evening and said very carefully that she thought I should know she'd seen Kevin's truck parked in front of my house twice in the past 10 days. Both times, she said, he sat in the truck for 20 minutes or so and then drove away without knocking. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. My son was parking outside my house and leaving without knocking. I called his cell, straight to voicemail. I called Sherry's cell, a number I'd used maybe 3 times in 6 years. It rang twice, and then she picked up and said hello, the way you say hello when you're hoping it's someone else. I told her I hadn't heard from Kevin in over a month. I kept my voice steady. I asked if everything was all right. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long, and she said yes, everything was fine. Kevin had just been really buried in work. She said he'd been meaning to call. She said he'd had a busy stretch. The whole time she was speaking, she had the smooth, practiced quality of someone reading from a card they prepared in advance. I asked if I could speak to him. She said he was out. I said I'd call back. She said sure, of course, absolutely. I drove to the house that Saturday morning. I didn't call ahead. I just drove. Their house is a 2-story colonial on a cul-de-sac in West Lynn, a nice neighborhood, nicer than what Kevin's contracting business should have been able to afford, though I hadn't thought too hard about that at the time they bought it. Sherry's car was in the driveway. Kevin's truck was not. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, longer. Through the frosted glass panel beside the front door, I could see lights on somewhere in the back of the house. I went around to the side gate, which was unlocked, and that's when I saw it. The padlock. The basement had a separate exterior entrance on the side of the house, a standard egress door, the kind that opens from inside and outside both. Every house like this has one. You use it to bring large items in and out without going through the main house. I'd helped Kevin hang the original door myself when they moved in, a Saturday in September, the 2 of us working through the afternoon, while Sherry ordered the pizza and chose not to come outside. The door now had a steel hasp screwed into the frame and the door itself, and through that hasp ran a brand new padlock. From the outside. You can lock a basement door from the outside for storage. People do it all the time. They put a padlock on to keep the riding mower or the holiday decorations secure. I knew that. I stood there and I listed those reasons in my head, one by one, like a man trying to talk himself off a ledge. I was good at that. I'd been doing it for 2 years. Then I heard a sound. It was faint, so faint that for a second I thought I'd imagined it. A slow, repetitive knock. Not urgent, not frantic. Methodical, the way you knock when you've been knocking for a very long time and you've learned to conserve what you have left. 3 knocks, a pause. 3 knocks. I stood there with my hand against the door and I felt the vibration of it in my palm. I said his name, Kevin. I said it through the door, not loud, just steady. The knocking stopped. Then a voice, hoarse and thin, said, "Dad." I don't have the words for what happened to me in that moment. I've tried to find them. I've been over it in my head hundreds of times. My legs went. That's the most accurate thing I can say. My legs simply went, and I caught myself against the door with both hands, and I stood there and breathed for 3 seconds before I was able to function again. I said, "Kevin, I'm getting this door open. Stay back." I found a flat-edged shovel leaning against the fence near Sherry's garden bed. I worked the blade into the gap between the hasp and the door frame, and I leaned on it with everything I had. And on the third try, the screws pulled out of the wood and the hasp swung free. I shoved the door open. The smell hit me first. It was close and stale, and underneath it was something else, something metallic and sharp that I recognized from the one time in my life I'd been in a hospital room where someone was very sick for a very long time. It was the smell of a body in distress, of a space that had not had fresh air in weeks. My son was sitting on the concrete floor with his back against the far wall and his knees pulled up. He was wearing a flannel shirt I recognized. I'd given it to him for his birthday 2 years ago, and it was hanging off him. He'd lost weight I couldn't account for. His beard had grown out. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the light from the doorway. He looked at me the way you look at something you stopped believing in. I crossed the room and I got down on the floor beside him and I put my arm around him, and my son, who had not cried in front of me since he was 9 years old, put his face against my shoulder and made a sound that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I'll need to tell you about the basement before I go further, because the basement tells you everything about what kind of woman Sherry is. It had been deliberately set up, with just enough to keep a person alive without being comfortable enough to be bearable. There was a case of bottled water, half of it gone. There was a box of protein bars, the cheap kind. There was a plastic bucket in the corner that I will not describe further. There was no phone. There was no window that wasn't covered over with wood panels that had been screwed from the outside. There was a cot with a single blanket, a battery-powered lantern. The batteries ran low, so the light had dimmed to almost nothing. She had not meant for him to die down there. She had meant for him to stay there long enough. Long enough for what? I'd understand later. Kevin told me in pieces over the next hour, sitting in my truck in their driveway with the heat running, while I called 911 on my cell and waited for the line to connect. He told me between long silences and the kind of pauses you have when you've been isolated long enough that speech itself becomes effortful. Sherry had been systematically moving money out of their accounts for at least 18 months. Kevin had started to notice small things at first, transfers he didn't recognize, a savings account that seemed lower than it should have been. When he asked her about it, she had explanations. Always explanations. She was moving money to a higher yield account. She was prepaying a contractor for a kitchen renovation she was planning as a surprise. She was handling a billing issue with their investment account. He believed her. He was embarrassed now that he believed her, and I told him that financial manipulation inside a marriage was a studied thing, that abusers, and I used that word deliberately, watched him flinch at it, counted on trust. That trust wasn't stupidity. 3 weeks before I found him, Kevin had sat down with their bank statements and gone through everything. It took him 2 days. By the end, he had a yellow legal pad full of transactions, transfers to accounts he'd never seen, withdrawals that corresponded with nothing, wire transfers out of state. The total he'd estimated, working only from what he could access, was somewhere north of $240,000. Some of it was money they'd built together. A significant portion of it was the money I'd given them. The $18,000, the $22,000, the $31,000, and more. He hadn't told me about. More she had borrowed against his name without telling him. More she had taken from accounts he hadn't known existed in his own name. When he confronted her, she was calm. He said that was the part that scared him most. She was completely calm. She told him he was confused. She told him he had a problem with anxiety, which was something she'd been telling him for years, and that he wasn't reading the statements correctly, and that she thought he needed to speak to someone. And then, 2 days after that conversation, he woke up in the basement. He didn't know how he'd gotten there. He thought she put something in his coffee. He'd woken up on the cot with the door already locked, his phone gone, his wallet gone, no way to reach anyone. She had visited him twice a day, morning and evening. She slid food and water under the door, the way you feed something you've caged. She spoke to him through the door in that same calm voice. She told him she was worried about him. She told him she called his father, meeting me, and let me know he needed some space. She told him she'd spoken to a doctor about his condition. She was building a story, piece by piece, in case anyone asked. The absent, erratic husband. The concerned wife managing a difficult situation. The father who'd been kept gently informed. She had not, of course, called me. She had counted on me being the kind of man who wouldn't push. She had almost been right. The deputies who responded were professional and thorough. One of them, a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, but had the stillness of someone who'd seen a great deal, took Kevin's statement in the driveway with the same careful patience you'd give a much longer story. The other one asked me to walk him through what I'd found, and I did, step by step, and he photographed everything, including the hasp I pried off the door, including the bucket, including the protein bar wrappers, including the low battery lantern. Sherry was not home. Her car was gone by the time the second patrol unit arrived. Someone must have tipped her, a neighbor, a notification on her phone from a camera I hadn't noticed, something. She had a head start of maybe 2 hours. She didn't get far enough. I found out later from the detective assigned to the case that Sherry had a storage unit in Tualatin registered under her sister's name. Inside it, investigators found a rolling luggage set, packed. 2 passports, one legitimate, one the detective declined to describe in detail, a prepaid debit card with a balance of over $60,000, and a folder of documents related to the sale of Kevin and Sherry's house, which Sherry had initiated 4 days earlier using a power of attorney document that Kevin had never signed but which bore a signature that was close enough to give her time. She was picked up at Portland International Airport trying to board a flight to Cancun. The charge was unlawful imprisonment. Then, as the investigation expanded, wire fraud, identity theft, and financial elder abuse, that last one because of the money she had taken from me, some of it through accounts opened in Kevin's name using forged documents, which meant she had used my trust in my son to reach into my finances without my knowledge or consent. The detective explained the elder abuse statute to me in his office one afternoon, and when he named the amount they had been able to trace directly to me, I had to ask him to say it again. I won't say the number here. I'll say it was more than I had told myself it was. Kevin stayed with me while the legal process moved forward. He slept in the guest room, the room that used to be his room until he was 18, and for the first 2 weeks he slept 14 hours a day the way you sleep when your body is paying a debt it accumulated in the concrete room with a dimming lantern. I made coffee in the mornings and left it on the counter and didn't hover. I know how to give people room. I learned it from my father, who gave too much room, and I'd tried to find the middle distance. Kevin would come out of a guest room at 9 or 10, pour himself a cup, and stand at the back door, looking out at the yard. Sometimes he talked, sometimes he didn't. We watched Blazers games on the couch in the evenings, and I let him work the remote, and I didn't ask how he was doing every 20 minutes the way I wanted to. There is a kind of help that is just presence. I tried to practice that. He asked me once, about 3 weeks in, why I kept calling when he stopped answering. He was looking at the television when he asked it, not at me. I said because you were quiet in a way that didn't sound like quiet. It sounded like something else. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he nodded. I asked him once, only once, whether he'd known, on some level, before the end. Whether there had been signs he'd explained away. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said yes. He said the signs were there for at least 2 years. He said he'd gotten good at looking past them because the alternative was a grief he wasn't ready for, and he looked at me when he said it, and I understood that he was talking about more than just Sherry. I didn't say anything. I reached over and turned up the volume on the game. Sherry accepted a plea agreement 8 months later. I was not in the courtroom for the reading. My attorney advised against it, said it could be used to complicate the civil suit we'd filed, which was still in process. Kevin was there. He texted me afterward, "Done." That was all. I sat in my kitchen and read that one word and held my phone in both hands for a while. The civil case took another 14 months. The amount recovered will not make me whole. It rarely does. But it was something. More than nothing. The detective who worked the case told me that the forensic accountant they brought in found accounts in 4 states and 2 transfers to an account in another country that are still being unwound. Sherry, he said, had been planning the exit for years. She had treated their marriage like a long con from very early on. When I asked how early, he said the evidence suggested she had opened the first hidden account 4 months after the wedding. Kevin filed for divorce the same week she entered the plea. He's doing better now. He got a job with a construction management company in Portland. Not his own business, not yet, but steady work with good people who knew him and vouched for him. He comes over for dinner on Sundays when his schedule allows. We don't talk about Sherry. We talk about the Blazers, the job, the neighbours, the robin that came back to the eave above my back door for a second spring running. Small things, real things, the kind of things that were there the whole time, just waiting for us to pay attention again. There's something I've thought about a great deal in the time since all of this happened. I've thought about the moment I was standing at that side gate, hand on the latch before I saw the padlock. I was already preparing to explain it away. Whatever I found, I was going to find a reason it was fine. I'd been doing that for 2 years, smoothing over the things that didn't add up, filing them somewhere quiet, choosing the version of events that let me keep the picture of my son and my family intact. I think about what would have happened if Florence hadn't walked her dog past my house, if she hadn't noticed the truck, hadn't called me, if I'd waited another week or 2 before deciding I needed to push past the silence. I try not to think about that for too long. What I'll tell you is this. If someone you love goes quiet in a way that doesn't sound like quiet, if the gap between you widens in a direction you can't explain, pay attention to the thing that doesn't fit. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't file it away. I know it's frightening. I know it's easier to choose a version that lets you sleep, but sometimes the door is bolted from the wrong side and the only person who's going to notice is you. My son waited in the dark and he knocked 3 times and he paused and he knocked again for a very long time, not knowing if anyone would ever hear. I'm grateful I was the kind of man who walked around the side of the house. I've thought a lot about the kind of man I was before I walked around the side of that house. Not a bad man, not an inattentive one, but a man who had learned over the course of a lifetime to smooth things over, to file the uncomfortable things somewhere quiet and choose the version of events that let him keep the picture intact. I was good at it. I'd had years of practice. What I've come to understand is that the choices we make, the small ones, the daily ones, the ones that feel like nothing, compound over time the same way money does, for better or worse. Every time I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, I was making a deposit into an account that Sherry was counting on. Every time I didn't push, didn't drive over unannounced, didn't let myself sit with the thing that didn't add up, I was giving her more time. Not because I was foolish, because I was kind and I'd confused kindness with looking away. There's a difference. I know that now. What saved Kevin wasn't luck. It was Florence walking her dog at the same time every day, paying attention the way decent people do when they've decided the world around them is worth noticing. It was me, finally, choosing not to explain away the silence for 1 more week. Small acts of paying attention. That's what it came down to. I used to think that being a good father meant protecting my son from hard things. What I learned in the year after I found him in that basement is that the more honest form of it is teaching him and yourself to see clearly, to hold what you know in one hand and what you want to be true in the other, and to have the honesty to know the difference. Kevin had seen the signs for 2 years. I had seen them too, in my own way. We had both chosen comfort over clarity. That was the real cost, and it wasn't measured in dollars. He's doing better now. We both are, but I carry the weight of those 6 weeks, not as guilt exactly, more as a reminder. A reminder that the people we love need us to be clear-eyed, not just warm-hearted. That real care sometimes looks like asking the question you're afraid to ask, driving over when you haven't been invited, not filing the thing away because the answer might be one you can't come back from easily. What Sherry counted on was that love makes people slow. that a father's instinct to believe the best about his family is a vulnerability to be exploited. And for a long time, she was right about that. But the thing about that kind of patience, the patient, grinding kind that keeps knocking 3 times and pausing and knocking again in the dark, is that it doesn't give up. Kevin knocked because some part of him still believed someone would come. I came because some part of me refused to stop hearing the silence. I don't know what you're carrying right now. I don't know whose calls you've been not quite making, whose silences you've been explaining away. I just know what I know from standing in a dim concrete room with my arm around my son while he made a sound I'll never unhear. The door doesn't open itself. Somebody has to walk around the side of the house.